ballroom looked beautiful that evening. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling like small stars, and round tables covered in white cloth filled the room. Glasses clinked gently as waiters moved quietly between guests. A low hum of polite conversation floated in the air. It was one of those formal company dinners where everyone tried to look confident and important at the same time. At the far end of the room, near a tall window covered with heavy curtains, stood a grand piano. It was polished so well that the lights reflected off its surface. Most people assumed it was placed there only to make the room look elegant. No one expected it to be used. It was simply part of the decoration, like the flower arrangements or the tall candles on each table. He stood near the back of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water. He wasn't someone who enjoyed these events. He did his job well, showed up on time, and rarely complained. But in social settings, he preferred to stay quiet. While others laughed loudly and told big stories, he listened. While others tried to impress senior managers, he kept his thoughts to himself. Some coworkers saw him as shy. Others thought he lacked confidence. A few simply overlooked him. He had been working at the company for 3 years, yet many people still struggled to remember small details about him. He was not loud. He did not push himself into conversations. He did his work carefully and went home. That night he wore a simple dark suit. It fit him well, but he still felt slightly uncomfortable in it. He adjusted his sleeve and scanned the room, searching for a familiar face. A small group from his department waved him over. He hesitated for a second, then walked toward them. They were in good spirits, laughing about something that had happened earlier in the week. One of them made a joke about how serious he always looked in meetings. Another teased him about rarely speaking unless directly asked. The tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the kind of teasing that hides behind smiles. "You must have some secret talent," one of them said, grinning. "Quiet people always do." He smiled politely. "Not really. Come on," another said. "You can't just be spreadsheets and emails." The group laughed. He laughed too, though softly. He had grown used to this. Being the quiet one meant people often tried to fill the silence for him. Someone's eyes drifted toward the grand piano. "Hey," one of them said suddenly, pointing. "There's your chance." He followed their gaze. "My chance for what?" "To entertain us," the coworker replied dramatically. "Go play something." The others laughed louder at the idea. "Yes, do it," another added. "Give us a performance." He shook his head quickly. "I don't play." "Sure you don't," someone said in a playful tone. "Everyone knows at least one song." "I really don't," he repeated, though his voice carried a hint of something else. Not fear, but hesitation. The teasing continued. It wasn't aggressive, but it grew stronger with each comment. "It's just for fun. We promise we won't judge. At least press a few keys." A few nearby colleagues began listening in, curious about what was happening. The small group grew slightly larger. The attention made him uncomfortable. He felt heat rising to his face. "I'll mess it up," he said. "That's the point," someone replied, laughing. "We need some entertainment." The word entertainment echoed in his mind. For them, it was a light moment. For him, it felt heavier than they realized. He glanced again at the piano. For a brief second, something shifted in his eyes. Something thoughtful, almost distant. But it disappeared quickly. The group began chanting lightly, not loudly enough to disturb the entire room, but enough to draw glances from nearby tables. "Piano! Piano! Piano!" A manager from another department noticed the commotion and walked over. "What's going on here?" "He's about to perform for us," one coworker announced proudly. The manager raised an eyebrow. "Oh really? I didn't know we had live music tonight." More people were watching now. The pressure grew. He could have refused again. He could have laughed it off and stepped away. But something inside him made a different choice. He exhaled slowly. "Fine," he said with a small shrug. "But don't expect much." Cheers erupted from the group. A few people clapped playfully as if introducing a comedian to the stage. He placed his glass down carefully on a nearby table. Each step toward the piano felt heavier than the last. The room seemed brighter somehow, the lights sharper. Conversations nearby slowed as people sensed something unusual was about to happen. When he reached the piano, he paused. Up close, it looked even more polished. He could see his reflection faintly on its surface. For a moment, he simply stood there. Someone from the crowd called out, "Don't be nervous." "I'm not," he replied, forcing a light smile. He pulled out the bench and sat down. The movement felt familiar, almost natural, though no one else could see that. He adjusted the distance slightly, then placed his hands on his lap. Behind him, soft laughter continued. A few guests from other tables turned their chairs slightly to watch. They expected a funny moment, a few random notes, maybe some awkward silence. He lifted the piano lid gently. The faint scent of polished wood rose into the air. His fingers hovered above the keys but did not touch them yet. Inside his chest, his heart beat faster. Not from fear of embarrassment, but from something deeper, something long buried. He let out a quiet breath. Then, almost playfully, he pressed a random key. The sound rang out clearly across the ballroom. A few people chuckled. He pressed another, slightly off rhythm. More laughter. "There we go!" someone shouted jokingly. He leaned into the joke, tapping a few more uneven notes, pretending to struggle. The laughter grew louder. Phones appeared in hands, ready to record what they assumed would be a funny memory. But as he pressed those scattered notes, something shifted inside him again. The sound of the piano filled his ears differently than it had from across the room. Up close, the vibration traveled through his fingertips. Felt warm, familiar. His shoulders slowly relaxed. The playful tapping paused for just a second longer than expected. A few in the crowd noticed the pause. The laughter softened slightly. He adjusted his posture without thinking about it. His back straightened. His hands hovered over the keys, no longer randomly, but with quiet intention. From behind him, someone whispered, "Okay, what's happening?" He pressed a new note. This time it wasn't random. It was gentle, clear. It lingered in the air. Then another note followed. And another. The scattered noise slowly began to form something softer. Not yet a melody, but no longer a joke either. The laughter faded, replaced by curiosity. At a nearby table, two guests stopped mid-conversation. One of them turned fully in his chair to face the piano. His fingers moved again, slightly more confidently now. The notes connected. A small pattern began to form. Someone lowered their phone. The room was still not silent, but the energy had shifted. What started as entertainment now felt uncertain, almost fragile. He didn't look back at the crowd. His eyes remained on the keys. For the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking about coworkers or managers or expectations. He was simply listening. Another small sequence of notes flowed from his hands, smoother this time. The sound carried more weight, more control. The teasing had stopped completely. A woman near the center of the room leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. He took another steady breath. The playful mask he had worn only moments earlier began to fall away, though quietly, almost invisibly. The room waited, and in that waiting, something unexpected was about to begin. The soft pattern of notes continued, gentle and careful, like someone testing the temperature of water before stepping in. The room had not gone completely silent yet, but the laughter had faded into low whispers. People were no longer watching for a mistake. They were listening. He kept his eyes on the keys. His fingers moved slowly at first, as if remembering something they had not done in a long time. The melody began to take shape. It was simple, but it carried feeling. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and honest. At one of the tables near the center, someone quietly said, "Wait, that's not random." Another leaned closer. "Does he actually know how to play?" The earlier teasing now felt distant, almost embarrassing. A few coworkers who had pushed him toward the piano shifted in their seats. Their smiles softened into looks of surprise. He played a short phrase and let it hang in the air. The sound of the last note seemed to float above the room before fading. In that small space of silence, something changed. Conversations stopped completely. Even the clinking of glasses from the catering staff paused for a moment. He did not rush. He let his hands hover for a second, then began again. This time the melody was clearer, recognizable. Not a famous song that everyone could immediately name, but something structured and meaningful. The notes connected smoothly, one flowing into the next. His shoulders relaxed more. The nervous energy that had filled him earlier began to disappear. His breathing slowed. The noise of the room faded from his mind. For years, he had kept this part of himself quiet. It felt strange and almost unreal to sit there now, in front of coworkers who had never seen him this way. But once his fingers started moving with purpose, the outside world felt smaller. A manager near the front table put down his fork and turned his chair fully toward the piano. A woman who had been scrolling through her phone locked her screen and placed it face down on the table. Even the hotel staff stood still near the walls, watching. The melody grew stronger. His left hand joined more confidently, adding depth beneath the higher notes. What began as something soft was now beginning to fill the space. Someone near the back whispered, "This isn't a joke anymore." His fingers moved with more certainty now. There was no more pretending, no more playful wrong notes. Every key he pressed had intention behind it. His posture was upright but not stiff. His expression was calm, focused. He shifted into a slightly faster section. The notes danced lightly, moving up and down in a way that felt alive. It was not flashy. It was not loud, but it carried skill. At the table where his coworkers sat, the mood had completely changed. One of them quietly said, "I had no idea." Another nodded slowly. "Me neither." A few minutes earlier they had expected to laugh. Now they felt something else, a mix of surprise and quiet respect. He continued, letting the music build slowly. The melody now had layers. His right hand carried the main tune while his left hand supported it with steady chords. The sound echoed gently off the ballroom walls, mixing with the soft lighting and elegant setting. It felt as if the piano had been waiting all evening for this moment. Near the entrance, a late guest stepped inside the ballroom. At first, they looked confused by the silence. Then they followed everyone's gaze toward the piano and stopped walking. He leaned slightly forward as the piece moved into a deeper section. The notes grew more emotional, almost reflective. It was the kind of sound that made people think of memories they hadn't visited in a while. One woman at a nearby table felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She didn't know why. The music simply touched something inside her. He wasn't performing to impress anymore. He wasn't thinking about applause or approval. His focus was entirely on the keys and the sound they created. His hands seemed to remember paths his mind had nearly forgotten. The melody shifted again, this time smoother, flowing like a calm river. The earlier playful mood of the evening felt far away now. The ballroom no longer felt like a place of corporate titles and formal speeches. It felt human. Someone who had been recording earlier slowly lowered their phone. This didn't feel like a moment to capture for humor. It felt personal. His fingers crossed slightly as he reached for higher notes. The movement was controlled, practiced. There was no hesitation now. At the front table, one of the senior executives leaned toward another and whispered, "How long has he been playing?" The other shook his head quietly. "I don't know." The music began to swell gently, growing a little louder, a little fuller. Not overwhelming, just confident. Each note carried clarity. He closed his eyes briefly while playing a softer phrase, as if trusting his hands completely. When he opened them again, he did not look at the crowd. He stayed with the piano. The shift in the room was complete. What had started as light teasing had turned into something almost sacred. The silence was no longer awkward. It was respectful. A waiter standing near the back felt goosebumps on his arms. He had heard many background pianists in hotel ballrooms before, but this felt different. This felt real. The melody rose into a gentle peak, then settled back down. It felt like a story being told without words. His coworkers exchanged quiet glances. They were seeing him differently now. Not as the quiet employee who avoided attention. Not as the easy target for harmless jokes. but as someone with depth they had never noticed. He moved into another transition, slightly faster, more complex. His fingers moved across the keys with smooth confidence. There was no stiffness in his hands. No sign of struggle. The room watched closely. At one table, someone whispered, "He's actually really good." Another replied softly, "He's better than really good." He felt the music pulling him further in. The outside world felt distant. For those few minutes, there were no deadlines, no office politics, no expectations. Only sound. He allowed a small pause in the melody, letting a single note ring longer than the rest. The quiet that followed was deep. No one dared to speak. Then he began again, this time softer, almost like a whisper through the keys. The sound felt intimate, as if he were sharing something personal without using words. The earlier laughter now felt almost impossible to imagine. The piece continued to unfold, revealing more layers, more feeling. Each section flowed naturally into the next. It did not feel rushed, felt lived. He adjusted slightly on the bench, comfortable now. His breathing matched the rhythm. His fingers moved with quiet assurance. Across the room, people who had never spoken to him before felt curious. Who was he? How had they never known? The melody began building once more, gently climbing upward. The sound filled the space without overpowering it. It wrapped around the guests like warm light. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed down. He pressed a series of higher notes that sparkled softly, then returned to the main theme, stronger now. The earlier hesitation was completely gone. His coworkers sat still, no longer whispering. A quiet understanding settled over the room. This was not luck. This was not something learned overnight. This was years of hidden practice, of silent dedication. The music moved toward what felt like the edge of something bigger. The audience could sense it even if they didn't know how. He lifted his hands slightly, then brought them down together in a richer chord. The sound resonated deeply. No one clapped. No one moved. They were waiting. And as his fingers prepared to continue, the entire ballroom leaned into the moment, realizing that what had begun as a joke had quietly transformed into something unforgettable. The music continued, steady and alive, as if it had found its own path and no longer needed permission to exist. The room stayed completely still. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed quieter now. Every ear was tuned to the sound coming from the piano. His fingers moved with growing confidence. The notes were no longer careful or testing. They were sure. They carried weight, like words spoken after years of silence. As he played, something inside him opened. A door he had kept closed for a long time. He was no longer in the ballroom in his mind. The polished floors and bright lights faded. In their place came the memory of a small living room from years ago. The walls had been plain, the furniture simple. Against one wall stood an old upright piano, slightly worn at the edges. It had not been perfect, but to him it had once felt like the most important thing in the world. He had been young when he first touched piano keys. First, it was just curiosity. Pressing a key and hearing a sound felt magical. But curiosity slowly turned into something deeper. He began to practice every day. Not because anyone forced him, but because he wanted to. The sound made sense to him in a way that other things did not. His family did not have much. Money was always tight. There were responsibilities that came early. Still, they found a way to keep that old piano in the house. It wasn't new. Some keys were slightly uneven, but it worked. He remembered sitting on a small wooden stool, feet barely touching the floor, trying to stretch his hands wide enough to reach certain notes. He would repeat the same piece again and again until it felt right. Sometimes he made mistakes. Sometimes he grew frustrated. But he never stopped. Back in the ballroom, his hands moved across the grand piano with that same dedication. Only now they were stronger, more experienced. The years between then and now had not erased the skill. They had only buried it. When he became older, life changed. School became serious. Expectations grew heavier. The world around him began to speak in practical terms. Stability, security, safe choices. Music, they said, was uncertain. He did not argue. He understood the fear behind those words. He saw the worry in his family's eyes. So he studied hard. He chose a steady path. He worked toward a career that promised regular income and predictable days. The piano became quieter in his life. At first, he still played in the evenings. After long days of studying, he would sit and let his fingers move freely. It was his way of breathing. But as responsibilities increased, the time grew shorter. Eventually, weeks would pass without him touching the keys. The old piano remained in the house, but it gathered a thin layer of dust. In the ballroom, he shifted into a deeper part of the melody. The sound grew richer, more emotional. Carried something personal now. Not just skill, but memory. The audience could feel it, even if they did not know the story behind it. There had been a moment years ago when he had almost chosen music fully. A teacher once told him he had rare control in his hands, that he could go far if he kept going. Those words had stayed with him for a long time. But life does not always follow the path of passion. Sometimes it follows the path of necessity. He remembered packing up his things when he moved for work. The old piano could not come with him. It stayed behind. He told himself he would find time later. That once things were stable, he would return to it properly. Later became months. Months became years. He rarely spoke about that part of his past. In the office, he was known for being reliable, quiet, focused. No one asked about hidden dreams, and he did not offer them. Until tonight. His fingers moved faster now, but not wildly. Every note was controlled. The melody climbed upward, almost like it was reaching for something it had once lost. At one table, a woman leaned forward with her hands clasped together. She felt like she was watching more than a performance. Felt like watching someone rediscover something. A senior executive whispered softly, "This feels personal." It was. The music shifted into a softer section again. Gentle, reflective. The kind of sound that makes you think of roads not taken, and quiet choices made long ago. He remembered the last time he had played seriously before tonight. It had been late at night in a small apartment. He had found a keyboard in a corner store and bought it without telling anyone. He played softly so neighbors would not complain. But even then, it had not lasted. Work had grown demanding. Overtime became common. The keyboard eventually sat unused. Back in the present, his hands pressed into a chord that echoed through the ballroom with depth and warmth. The sound was fuller than anything he had played so far tonight. He was no longer holding back. The music swelled, not in volume alone but in feeling. Carried years of quiet practice. Years of letting go. Years of telling himself that some dreams were not practical. His coworkers watched him as if seeing him for the first time. One of them thought back to every meeting where he had stayed silent. To every moment they had mistaken his quiet nature for lack of confidence. Now it felt like they had misunderstood him completely. The melody flowed smoothly into a more complex passage. His left hand moved steadily, grounding the music. His right hand danced lightly above it. He did not look nervous anymore. He looked at peace. The ballroom felt smaller somehow, more intimate. The bright lights no longer felt harsh. They felt warm. He pressed a series of notes that rose gently, then settled back into the main theme. The piece felt like a conversation between his past and present. There had been sacrifices. There had been compromises. But the music had never truly left him. A quiet realization passed through the room. This was not someone who had casually learned a few tunes. This was someone who had once loved this deeply. He allowed another pause, letting the sound fade naturally before continuing. The silence between notes felt as meaningful as the notes themselves. For a moment, he thought about the old piano back home. He wondered if it was still there, if anyone had touched it recently. The thought did not bring sadness. It brought gratitude, because even though he had stepped away from music for a time, it had not stepped away from him. He moved into another expressive section, slightly faster but controlled. His fingers curved perfectly over the keys, each movement precise. The room remained still. No one checked their phone. No one whispered now. The music told a quiet truth, that people are more than their job titles, more than their daily routines. Sometimes, the most powerful parts of a person are the ones no one sees. He reached the end of the passage with a gentle flourish, not dramatic, but confident. The final note of this section lingered in the air. As it faded, he prepared to continue. Not as someone proving a point, not as someone trying to impress, but as someone who had just remembered who he used to be. The last note from the previous passage faded slowly into the air, but no one moved. It was as if the entire ballroom was holding its breath, afraid to break the moment. The soft golden lights above seemed warmer now, and the grand piano no longer looked like decoration. It looked alive. He did not rush into the next part. His hands hovered gently above the keys, his fingers relaxed but ready. His face was calm, focused, and quietly confident. If someone had walked into the room at that moment, they would have thought he had been hired to perform. He began again, this time with more strength. The melody rose in a way that felt bold but not loud. It had presence. His left hand laid down steady chords, deeper and fuller than before. His right hand carried the main theme, but now it felt richer, layered with feeling. The sound filled the ballroom completely. At one of the tables near the back, a man who had been known for talking the most during company events sat perfectly still. His elbows rested on the table, and his eyes were fixed on the piano. The earlier smile of amusement had disappeared from his face. In its place was something else, respect. The music continued to build. It was not rushed. It grew naturally, like a wave rising slowly before reaching the shore. Every note seemed carefully chosen, yet effortless at the same time. The room was completely silent now. Even the kitchen doors near the back of the ballroom stayed closed. No dishes clattered. No staff whispered. It was as if everyone understood that something important was happening. He leaned slightly into the keys as the melody reached a stronger section. His fingers moved with confidence across the higher notes, then dropped down to meet the deeper tones. The sound echoed softly against the walls and returned, wrapping around the audience. There was no sign of nervousness anymore. The coworkers who had encouraged him as a joke earlier now felt a quiet embarrassment. They replayed their teasing in their minds. What they thought would be a funny moment had turned into something powerful. One of them quietly muttered, "We really didn't know." Another nodded slowly, unable to take their eyes off him. The music shifted into a dramatic but controlled passage. It was not flashy or overly dramatic. It was honest. There was strength in it, but also vulnerability. It felt like someone speaking openly after years of silence. At the front table, one of the senior leaders leaned back in his chair, clearly moved. He had attended many formal dinners, heard many hired musicians, and listened to countless speeches. But this felt different. This was not background music. This was personal. The melody softened briefly, pulling the audience closer. It was like a quiet conversation in a crowded room, the kind that makes you lean in so you don't miss a word. He pressed a gentle sequence of notes that seemed to float. The softness carried emotion without being dramatic. A woman near the center of the room blinked quickly, surprised to feel her eyes sting. He did not look up at the crowd. He stayed connected to the piano, fully present. His breathing was steady, matching the rhythm of the piece. His shoulders were relaxed, his movements natural. The piano responded beautifully. Each key sounded clear and warm. The instrument, which had sat untouched for hours, now seemed proud to be heard. The melody began climbing again, stronger this time. It felt like it was reaching for something higher, something bold. His fingers moved faster, but there was no panic in the motion. It was controlled, practiced. The sound grew fuller, spreading through the room like light. People exchanged glances, but no one spoke. They were witnessing something they had not expected. They were seeing a different side of someone they thought they understood. He transitioned into a powerful sequence of chords that resonated deeply. The vibration seemed to pass through the floor and into the chairs. It was not overwhelming. It was grounding. The room felt smaller, closer. Titles and positions no longer mattered. In that moment, everyone was simply a listener. His expression shifted slightly, not into a smile, but into something peaceful. There was a quiet joy in his eyes. Not the joy of applause or praise, but the joy of doing something that felt true. The music reached its most intense point so far. Notes flowed rapidly but smoothly, like water over stones. The melody carried both strength and softness at once. At a table near the side, someone whispered, "He should be on a stage somewhere." But even that whisper felt too loud. The audience was no longer just watching. They were feeling. He allowed the music to peak naturally, then slowly brought it down into a gentler rhythm. The transition was seamless. It felt like the end of a storm, when the sky clears and everything is calm again. His fingers moved into a slower section, repeating a theme from earlier in the performance. But now it sounded different, deeper, more mature. It carried everything that had happened in the last few minutes. The earlier playful notes were long forgotten. The woman who had been scrolling on her phone earlier now had both hands resting on the table, eyes wide, fully present. She would later struggle to explain why the music had affected her so strongly. A few guests sat with their hands folded together, as if in quiet thought. The melody softened further, each note placed gently and carefully. The silence between them felt intentional, meaningful. He was not performing for attention anymore. He was sharing something real. The final section of this part began to form. The music hinted at an ending, but not quite yet. It carried a sense of completion approaching, but still held back. He played a sequence of chords that felt reflective, almost like looking back at a long journey. There was pride in it, but also humility. One of his co-workers felt their chest tighten slightly. They realized how easy it had been to overlook him, how simple it was to label someone based on surface impressions. The music grew just a little stronger again, as if gathering its final strength. His hands moved confidently across the keys, not hesitating, not doubting. The entire ballroom felt connected through the sound. Then he pressed a deep, resonant chord that lingered beautifully. The vibration seemed to settle into the walls, into the tables, into the air itself. He held the moment for just a breath longer. No one clapped. No one dared. He let the chord fade slowly, his hands still resting lightly on the keys. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of surprise. Full of respect. Full of realization. He had not finished yet, but something had already changed. The room that once laughed now sat completely still, fully aware that they had just witnessed more than a performance. They had witnessed someone reveal a part of himself that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The deep chord slowly faded into silence. His fingers remained resting lightly on the keys, as if he was listening to the last vibration disappear. The room did not move. No chairs scraped the floor. No glasses clinked. Felt like time had paused. He lifted his hands gently but did not stand up. Instead, he placed them back down and began the final movement. This time, the melody was softer than before. Not weak, but calm. Carried the feeling of closure. The kind of sound that makes you reflect instead of react. It felt like someone speaking their last words in a meaningful conversation. The notes were simple at first, repeating a theme that had appeared earlier in the performance. But now it sounded different. Felt complete. His face showed quiet focus. There was no sign of nerves. No need to impress. The music had already done its work. At one of the tables, a man who rarely showed emotion found himself swallowing hard. He didn't know why. The music wasn't loud or dramatic, but it touched something personal. Something about missed chances, about hidden talents, about parts of life left unexplored. The melody gently rose again, one final time. Not as high as before, not as powerful, just enough to remind everyone of what they had heard. He leaned slightly forward as he played a smooth run of notes, each one clear and steady. His hands moved with confidence, but there was tenderness in his touch. The room felt warmer somehow. A coworker who had teased him earlier felt a quiet sense of regret. Not because the teasing had been cruel, but because it had been careless. They had assumed they knew him. They had been wrong. The music began to slow. Each note became more spaced out, more intentional. The pauses between them grew longer. He allowed the silence between phrases to speak just as much as the sound. The final section unfolded naturally, without drama. He did not rush toward the ending. He let it arrive on its own. His left hand pressed a deep, steady chord. His right hand followed with a gentle melody above it. The two blended together perfectly. A woman near the front table pressed her fingers together tightly. She didn't want the music to stop. He played one last variation of the main theme, softer than ever before. Felt like a quiet goodbye. Then came the final sequence. His fingers moved slowly across a small pattern of notes that felt familiar, like returning home after a long journey. The melody resolved gently, without force. He pressed the last chord. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was complete. The sound hung in the air for a long moment. He kept his hands on the keys, allowing the vibration to fade fully. He did not turn around right away. He stayed still, almost as if he was saying goodbye to something private. The silence that followed was deep and pure. For a brief second, no one knew what to do. It was as if clapping too quickly would break something fragile. Then, from somewhere near the center of the room, one pair of hands began to clap. The sound was sharp in the quiet space. Another pair joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Not the kind given out of courtesy. This was loud, real, emotional. People stood up from their chairs without thinking. Some even cheered. The sound filled the room in a way completely different from the music, but just as powerful. He slowly lifted his hands from the keys and turned around. For the first time since he began, he looked at the audience fully. He blinked, almost surprised by the reaction. The applause continued, growing even louder. A few people shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled widely. Some clapped above their heads. His coworkers were standing too. The ones who had laughed earlier now clapped the hardest. One of them even wiped their eyes quickly before anyone noticed. He stood up from the bench, slightly unsure of what to do with his hands. He gave a small, modest nod. No dramatic bow. No big gesture. Just a simple acknowledgement. The applause did not stop. A senior executive at the front table began clapping slowly but firmly, a sign of deep respect. Soon, others followed his rhythm. He felt heat rise to his face again. But this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from something else. Something unfamiliar. Appreciation. He stepped slightly away from the piano, unsure whether to return to his seat or remain there. The clapping slowly began to soften, though it still filled the room. Someone near the front called out, "Why didn't you tell us you could play like that?" Laughter followed, but this time it was warm, not teasing. He gave a small shrug and smiled. "It's been a while." Another voice said, "A while? That was incredible." A few people moved closer to him near the piano, still clapping lightly. Questions began forming in their eyes before they were even spoken. "How long have you been playing? Did you study music? Why didn't you ever mention this?" He answered quietly, humbly, "I learned when I was younger." He did not give a long explanation. He did not turn the moment into a story about sacrifice or regret. He kept it simple. Across the room, people were still talking about what they had just heard. The mood of the entire evening had shifted. Earlier, the dinner had felt formal and routine. Now it felt alive. The piano no longer looked like decoration. It looked important. One of his co-workers approached him slowly. Their expression had completely changed from earlier in the night. "I'm sorry," they said quietly. "We didn't know." He shook his head gently. "It's okay." And he meant it, because the teasing had led to this moment. He glanced back at the piano for a second, almost thoughtfully. Something inside him felt lighter, like a door that had been closed for years had quietly opened again. The applause had faded now, but the energy in the room remained strong. People returned to their seats slowly, still smiling, still talking about the performance. The sound of conversation filled the ballroom again. But it was different now. It carried excitement instead of routine small talk. He walked back toward his table. This time, people made space for him immediately. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. As he sat down, several coworkers leaned toward him at once. "That was unbelievable. I had no idea you were that good. You've been hiding this from us?" He laughed softly. "I wasn't hiding it, but maybe he had been, in a way. Not on purpose. Just quietly." Across the room, a few executives continued glancing toward him. The look in their eyes was no longer casual recognition. It was respect. The dinner resumed. Waiters began moving again. Conversations picked up. But something permanent had shifted. He reached for his glass of water and took a small sip. His hands were steady. Inside he felt calm. Not proud in a loud way. Not overwhelmed. Just grounded. For years, that part of him had stayed in the background of his life. Tonight, it had stepped forward without warning. And as the room slowly returned to its rhythm, one thing was clear. What began as a joke had ended as something unforgettable. The rest of the evening did not return to normal, even though the dinner continued as planned. The music had changed something in the room, and everyone could feel it. He sat quietly at his table again, but this time the silence around him felt different. It was not the silence of being overlooked. It was the silence of being noticed. People kept turning toward him. Some smiled when their eyes met his. Others gave small nods of respect. A few guests from other departments who had never spoken to him before walked over to introduce themselves. One of the senior leaders approached his table with a calm but serious expression. The conversation around them softened as the leader stopped beside him. "That was remarkable," the leader said in a steady voice. "You have real talent." He felt slightly embarrassed by the attention but managed a polite smile. "Thank you. I just used to play a lot." "Used to?" the leader asked. He nodded. "It's been years." The leader looked at him thoughtfully, as if trying to understand how something like that could be placed on hold for so long. "Well," he said gently, "don't let that kind of skill stay hidden." With that, he returned to his seat. The words were simple, but they stayed in his mind. For the rest of the night, conversations felt warmer. People were more relaxed, more open. It was as if the performance had reminded everyone that they were more than job titles and deadlines. When the dinner finally ended and guests began leaving, several coworkers gathered around him again. "You have to play at the next company event. You can't disappear back into spreadsheets after this." He laughed softly. "We'll see." But something inside him had already shifted. When he stepped outside the hotel, the night air felt cool and fresh. The city lights shimmered in the distance. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply. He had not planned for any of this. He had walked to the piano as a joke. He had expected a few laughs, maybe some teasing for pressing the wrong keys. Instead, he had felt something wake up. On the drive home, he kept replaying the moment in his mind. Not the applause, not the compliments, but the feeling of his fingers on the keys. The calm, the connection. It had felt like meeting an old friend again after many years apart. When he reached home, he did not turn on the television. He did not check his phone immediately. He sat down quietly in his living room. The space felt different somehow. Smaller, quieter. He thought about the old piano from his childhood. He wondered if it was still in that same corner of the house. He wondered if the keys still carried that slightly uneven feel. For the first time in years, he did not push those thoughts away. The next morning at work, the atmosphere changed in small but noticeable ways. As he walked into the office, someone from another department waved at him with a wide smile. A coworker gave him a playful bow. Another stopped him near the coffee machine and said, "I still can't believe that was you." He felt slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but not in a bad way. It was new. During the morning meeting, something else shifted. Normally, he would sit quietly, speaking only when necessary. But when a discussion began about a challenging project, he shared an idea confidently. Not louder than usual, just clearly. The room listened, not because he had played the piano the night before, but because they saw him differently now. They realized he was capable of more than they had assumed. Respect changes how people listen. Over the next few days, the story of the performance spread through the company. People who had not attended the dinner heard about it from those who had. Some exaggerated parts of it. Others described it with quiet admiration. He tried not to let it define him completely. He still completed his tasks. He still showed up on time. He did not suddenly become someone else. But something inside him felt steadier. That weekend, he did something he had not done in a long time. He visited a music store. He told himself it was just to look around. The store smelled faintly of wood and polished instruments. Guitars hung on the walls. A few keyboards were displayed near the center. He walked slowly through the aisles, taking his time. When he reached the piano section, he paused. One of the employees noticed him and asked if he would like to try one. He hesitated for only a second. Then he sat down. His fingers rested on the keys gently, almost respectfully. He pressed a simple chord. The sound felt clear and bright. He smiled, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because it felt right. He played softly for a few minutes, just enough to remind himself that the connection was still there. When he left the store that day, he carried something with him. Not a piano, but a decision. He did not need to abandon his career. He did not need to rewrite his entire life. But he could make space. Small space. Time after work. A few hours on weekends. The following week, a keyboard appeared in his apartment. Nothing grand. Nothing expensive. Just something simple and honest. He placed it near the window. The first evening he sat down to play again at home. There was no audience. No applause. No pressure. Just him. And the sound. He started slowly, fingers remembering patterns they had once known by heart. It felt unfamiliar for a moment, then natural again. He realized something important. The performance at the dinner had not been about proving others wrong. It had been about reminding himself who he was. At work, the teasing stopped completely. In its place came small conversations about music, about hobbies, about things people had once put aside. Interestingly, others began sharing hidden parts of themselves too. One coworker admitted they used to paint but had stopped years ago. Another mentioned writing stories in college but never continuing. The piano had done more than entertain. It had opened something in the room. Months passed. He played regularly now. Not every day, but often enough. At the next company gathering, someone jokingly pointed toward the piano again. This time there was no teasing. Just expectation. He walked to it willingly, and as he placed his hands on the keys once more, he realized something simple but powerful. He had never truly lost that part of himself. He had only paused it. And sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected moment, one joke, to bring a forgotten dream back into the light. The room that once laughed had learned something that night. And so had he. That people are never just what they appear to be. That quiet does not mean empty, and that hidden talents, when given even the smallest chance, can change everything.